Thank you very much, Raisa, and I'm very pleased to be here as a guest lecturer, so-called. Yes, I haven't been working in this project, and this is the sort of first time I'm been hearing about the contents and the details of the project, and thus far I've been very delighted to hear what you have been working with grant money, and I'm also delighted to hear that people are actually interested in similar questions than me, and doing some real research and practice-oriented research also on the issue. And well, I'm not going to introduce myself anymore or once again, but as you heard, I'm from the discipline of aesthetics. It's practically philosophy. So I'm not going to be here as a representative of any kind of more practical applications, but more about the conceptual side and the theoretical basis of this sustainability issue we've been talking about. And in this presentation, I'm going to examine this nature of some kind of phenomenon called urban aesthetics. And I'm going to ask that what does the aesthetic mean in the urban context altogether? And what are thought to be the central aesthetic qualities of the urban sphere and why? And I'm not going to talk only about the urban environment, which is the main emphasis of my own work, but this is not solely about the environment, but the sphere as a more all-encompassive issue. But yes, furthermore, I will ask why do the aesthetics matter in the first place, and what's the relevance or significance of this aesthetics in the urban sphere, and what kind of consequences and implications of the differing aesthetic preconditions perhaps might have. And what follows here is a particular reading of the history of Western philosophy and its main tendencies, and this kind of reading is not by any means supposed to be an all-encompassing or impeccable view of the matter, but in my view it helps conceiving the big picture and one's position in it perhaps a little bit better. And especially this kind of reading gives rise to a perspective that allows for a critique of the largely prevailing and tacit yet tremendously influential concepts of aesthetics in general and of urban aesthetics in particular. And the history of Western philosophy is thoroughly marked by the controversial relationship between conceptual thought and sensory perception. That is, the supposedly universal truth of how things are and the particular observations of how things appear to be. And philosophical aesthetics, in turn, has been in the epicenter of this crisis ever since its formal beginning in the 18th century. Striving to find the fundamental principles underlying the complex connection between sensory quality and the extrasensory truthfulness of any particular experience. And in other words, aesthetics has been primarily about the relation between the two supposedly different and separate dimensions of the reality, between the senses and the supersenses, between the phenomenal world and the transcendent realm, between the subjective impression and the objective truth. And such philosophical inquiries, trying to establish the ultimate foundation for truthful or justified sensory experience, can be catered under the label of foundational. Sorry, this is a tricky word. Foundationalism. To be sure, universal and supposedly stable supersensus, transcendent realm of so-called objectivity, has always had a certain priority, so that the perspective-related and fluctuating sensuous phenomenal world of subjectivity has been the problematic issue, calling for a satisfying and some kind of pacifying resolution. And this setting has had its reflections on the role and status of concepts and conceptual truths as the universally valid realm of conceptual thought has typically been somehow presupposed, whereafter the route from these occasional particular sensory experiences to the already prevailing universal truths has been the major source of puzzling. And apparently these kind of concepts and questions have to do with the questions of knowing and knowledge. That is, knowing the truth and the knowledge about the truths of the world. And they thus seem to fall within the scope of epistemology. And in this sense, it is not at all clear what might be the role of aesthetics in here. But despite the commonness of such wondering, or precisely because of it, it is worth mentioning that the so-called founder of the aesthetics, I mean aesthetics as a proper discipline of philosophy, Alexander Baumgarten specifically envisioned aesthetics as a particular form of knowledge, that is, the sensuous knowing. Therefore, judging from the historical point of view, aesthetics has primarily to do with the very fundamental traits of our worldly experience, and the more recent conceptions of aesthetics as having to do something with connotations of superficial and perhaps immoral pleasure, they seem perhaps rather simplified or ill-informed conceptions of the matter. And in other words, the pleasurability of the so-called aesthetic experience itself, the mere occurrence of aesthetic pleasure in experience, is never the case altogether, but there's always more to it. And despite the mentioned emphasis on knowing and the gaining knowledge from an experience, the presumptions about the connectedness of the senses and the supersenses have had their influence on also the other way around, that is, regarding the route from the universal to the particular, from the conceptual to the sensory quality. And on the basis of such described foundationalist accounts, normative assertions regarding the sensory experience indeed follow, as the immediate experience and its quality are evaluated from the knowledge-related cognitive point of view. In short, the argument goes like this. One has to pay attention to the right aspects of the reality and take the right background information into account if one is to achieve appropriate and justified aesthetic experience. And put differently, the pleasurability of the aesthetic experience, or at least its justification, may be questioned on the grounds of alleged misunderstandings or misuse of information. This is the main idea also behind the present-day theory of aesthetics that is called Cognitivism, which is actually rather influential in the field of environmental aesthetics. And here is a quite an extreme example of the aesthetic cognitivism. If I'm enjoying, say, a view over a historical city, this is Rome, someone might come and deny my right to the pleasure I was gaining from the cityscape by insisting that I have erroneous or somehow insufficient knowledge about the certain aspects of the local history. I might not, for instance, know that the development of the city has involved phases overshadowed by serious injustice and social inequality due to the use of slavery, for example. But in my view, this seems rather exaggerated, since I might not have been in a position to know every detail of the local history. And moreover, the features that I was appreciating probably were not bound to the past injustices in a deterministic way. I mean, the features could have been there, even though the history would have been different and morally more acceptable. The point of such aesthetic cognitivism is, however, perhaps more understandable in a case with a more limited scope of application. Considering an example provided by Alan Carlson, one of the leading proponents of the cognitivist account, the aesthetic experience of artworks has to happen within certain boundaries and within a certain context of conceptual knowledge about the history of art. Here is a quotation from Carlson. For instance, the appropriate appreciation of a work such as Picasso's Guernica, pictured here, from 1937, requires that we experience it as a painting and moreover as a cubist painting, and therefore that we appreciate it in light of our knowledge of paintings in general and of cubist paintings in particular. Quotation ends. And this line of thought, in this particular case, seems totally appropriate and totally acceptable to me. But the point here is that we have to be quite careful when drawing conclusions and making generalizations on the basis of such examples. And the most important limitation has to do with the fundamental difference between art and concrete everyday environments, such as cities. And the major source of rather serious misunderstandings is that unlike art, urban environment is never primarily an object of knowledge. Cities simply are not there to be perceived or to be contemplated, but to be used and lived in. And neglecting this profound difference means, above all, that the aesthetics of various environments still is understood through the lens of philosophical art theory. Environmental aesthetics and its peculiarities are still reduced to the framework of modern visual art. And on the conceptual level, this has meant an implicit presupposition of an art world-like discourse of urban aesthetics. That is, a presupposition that there is some kind of common story about the history and development of the urban environment, like there is some kind of common story about the history and the development of art. The problem is that there simply is no such master narrative about the essence of a particular city. On the contrary, the history of any city is typically full of conflicts, and the urban environment has developed along continuous political strives over the characteristics of the city. Strives over its physical, social, and functional aspects, as well as its symbolic dimensions and aesthetics. Indeed, instead of the master narrative that crystallizes the essence of a city and its aesthetics, there is a polyphony, or even cacophony, of differing and often incompatible voices that either supplement each other or try to silence each other. The idea of such master narrative is still powerful, and it has had its remarkable influence on the development of urban environments. Especially a certain branch of aesthetic cognitivism has provided a foundation for a specific master narrative, leading to a hegemony of expertise-based evaluation of aesthetic quality in urban sphere. And accordingly, the aesthetic dimension of cities has been understood mainly through architecture, as well as holistic or physical city planning that regards the city itself as an artwork. To be more exact, urban environments have been conceived either as a collection of architectural pieces that exist as independent and solid sculpture-like artworks, or as abstract forms and patterns of constructed entities such as buildings, roads, parks, etc., that are best viewed from above, from the aerial perspective. But in either cases, the urban environment is treated as an object. It is objectified, and there always remains a certain distance between the observer and the observed, aesthetically relevant objects. The main problem behind this kind of cognitivism-inspired account is exactly that it treats the city as an object of knowledge, as an object of contemplation, as an object of aesthetic evaluation. Indeed, it is precisely the act of objectification that gives rise to the unresolved problems here. And this has to do with the presupposition that objects themselves are objective and thus somehow value neutral. That objects simply are what they are, that they are the same for everyone. The talk of such objectivity always involves the imaginary universal subject, that is, a subject that does not have any personal history or any personal characteristics, and who thus experiences the urban environment just like anybody does. And here is a quotation from quite well-known and perhaps a little bit infamous presenter of modernist architecture, Le Corbusier, from the early 20s. And this is, in my view, a quite radical application of the universal subject view. But yeah, there's also an implicit view, implicit yet compelling demand for a knowledge-based and thus rational consensus inherent in the cognitivist view. And in other words, there is an idea of consensus about the aesthetic quality of the city, a consensus that is informed by the so-called objective knowledge and the objective expertise. But however, the value neutrality of such consensus is highly questionable, and the hypothetical consensus, by and large, reflects the worldview of the so-called aesthetic elite, which might be said that Le Corbusier also represents the view of aesthetic elite. And I mean, from a contemporary perspective, such consensus-centered conception is, in short, absurd. It is important to understand that cities are cultural melting pots, and that there neither is nor can be any singular privileged way to experience the city. And in addition to this, every urbanite does have a fundamental right to aesthetically satisfactory habitat. And in this sense, urban aesthetics should be primarily aesthetics of diversity, not aesthetics of consensual uniformity. But this kind of aesthetics of diversity, in turn, it doesn't mean any kind of indifferent relativism or isolation-driven escapism, but merely recognizing the realities and conditions on which the common urban life necessarily is grounded. The central task related to urban aesthetics is thus not finding any kind of universal aesthetic principles or on which anyone could agree, but rather recognizing and understanding the different views and reconciling them appropriately. That is, in a way that promotes social equality, a sense of belonging, and socio-cultural sustainability altogether. But it is still true that cities cannot be planned and built so that every possible view would be taken into account. Some generalizations simply have to be made in order to provide basis for governing the city. And some governing is, in my opinion, absolutely necessary to enhance and achieve sustainability. Sustainable cities and sustainable urban life forms do not just pop up if people are led to do every decision and to organize their everyday lives just by themselves. From the aesthetic point of view, the key thing here is to better understand the structure and the contents of an everyday urban experience. And this view relies on a quite distinctive conception of aesthetics as an organizing principle of the experiential life world. According to this conception, aesthetics has to do with those particular experience values and meanings that also guide our day-to-day choices, either consciously or unconsciously. To be more exact, aesthetics has to do with the experience of certain properness related to choices and the available alternatives. And here I'm not claiming that aesthetics would be replacing or be identical with the ethical reasoning in a choice situation, but that aesthetics by and large determines how the different alternatives appear in the choice situation. And aesthetics is the guiding principle that forms the context or the background for everyday life and its innumerable choices. It is precisely the innumerable choices of our everyday lives that constitute the sustainability or the unsustainability of our life forms. This is why aesthetics does have significant ethical consequences and implications that, in my opinion, have not been understood properly enough thus far. The majority of people already live in urban settlements worldwide and in Finland, so it is the urban life form that we have to focus on here. By understanding better the experiential context or background of the choices made in the so-called urban condition, it is possible to make a difference. It may be tempting to say that people don't always make rational choices, but I would say that it's time to consider the applied concept of rationality once again. Aesthetics is a fundamental part of a human experience, and it is not possible, or at least sensible, to try to think of rationality without an aesthetic component involved. And this is something what a project called Urban Aesthetics Revisited is all about. Thank you.